Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to the master analysis video on Frank Frazetta. This is going to be a preview of a much larger video that I'm going to make available on my Gumroad, which is going to be an in-depth analysis of Frank Frazetta's work and some of the different techniques and the different painting styles it is that he uses, the different kind of creative decisions that he makes. And so I'm gonna be breaking down some things it is that I notice about this illustration here, this Conan illustration, and we're gonna see what we can learn from it. And then the link to the full video will either uh, be in the description, or I'll be making another trailer video for it in the future for people that want to check out a more in-depth analysis of some of his other work. But for now, let's go ahead and let's take a look at this painting here. So one of the first things it is that I want to draw your attention to is that Frazetta is a master at being able to use a very simple and powerful composition. So I'm going to drop this into grayscale here, and immediately what it is that I notice, and this is very common in his work, is that we have this kind of triangle composition going on here. Now, the reason why we have this triangle composition is that the triangle is generally a visual representation of strength. It's a representation of power. When we look at the triangle, it looks very sturdy. It looks upright, and it seems to be. It's almost as if these two corners here are pointing to a focal point, which would be up here at the top. And if we look at the illustration from that perspective, then it becomes clear where it is that our focal point is supposed to be, which is obviously Conan right here and the expression on his face. Now, there's a bunch of different things it is that we can learn just from taking an image like this and bringing it into grayscale in terms of the decisions it is that he's making with his art. And so I actually went ahead and I broke down. Um, I have this value chart over here from Cycra, who's a YouTuber, and I'm going to include Cycra's link to his video on value if I can find it in the link in the description. But this is something it is that I did when I first started out, and is something I highly recommend any artist do, which is to get this value chart here, which is basically breaking down the values and how they relate to color. And go ahead and start going through here, and you can basically play a game with yourself and try to see if you can get your eyedropper tool and try to guess where it is that you try to guess what value is what. So if I'm looking over here at this and I'm trying to get the value of, say, her flesh, like this light spot that's on her breast right here, I might say that that is a 9. Okay. And if I look over here, I can see on my color wheel exactly where it is that that falls. And I want to now sample from that area and see if it moves at all, right? And now I see that it jumped down quite a bit, right? So here's 9, and then here's where it is that I sampled. It jumps down quite a bit. So perhaps it's an 8. So let's go back here. See, it didn't move as much. So this is a good way of you're basically playing a game with yourself to see if you can guess where the values are and how close it is that you can get. And by doing this process of looking at the values and trying to, like I said, make a game out of it and say, I'm going to pick this right here. And since this is so light, I'm going to assume that this area right here is a 6, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick 6, and then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to touch here, and it looks like it's actually further down. So is it a 5? Let's see. So the other thing is that you want to make sure that you're getting somewhat close to the same area. right? So this area is a 6. So you have to be very particular, especially with his paintings, about where it is that you color pick from. Otherwise, you can get kind of confused because he likes to blend the different values together. He does a really good job of blending values together, right? So some of the other things it is that you'll notice whenever you break this down is, again, if I pull back and I look at this image from afar, we can see that Frazetta always designed his paintings to be very readable from a distance, right? And so there is this very, you could say it's a very simple contrast of dark and light values that is going on in this image that push the image of Conan and the woman forward towards the viewer, right? And this is something that Frazetta probably picked up from doing comic books and working so much in pen and ink. Because Frazetta, he worked in comics before he started to do these paintings. So, with that said, it's very clear that he's making a couple of different decisions that is helping him in this process, right? So, if we look at the background and we look at this foreground area here, we can notice a couple of things. For one thing, there is a contrast. Obviously, there is a contrast between, so let's go ahead and let's get rid of this. There is a contrast. So we'll go ahead and put contrast between, there's a contrast between, let me grab my red here. There's a contrast between uh, basically dark and light, as we can see, obviously. But there's also a contrast between hard edges and soft edges, which you can find the soft edges all throughout this painting, right? And by that, I mean that there is a very clear distinction because of the value and because of the brushwork it is that he's using. There is a very fine distinction between this arm and the shape of this arm and the space back here. But if I go down here and I look at the shapes down here, I see that some of this sticks out a little bit. Some of it sticks out a little bit, right? But there's a lot of what looks like random shapes that are kind of thrown in here. And this was done intentionally. And then we can also see the same thing happening here in the background as well. Right? We see there's not as clear of a distinction between this, there's this skull back here, but the values are so close to one another. So if I'm to sample from here and then sample from here, I can see that the values are very close to one another if I look at the color wheel over to the side. The values are very close to one another. And the effect it is that that gives by putting the values very close to one another is it gives this kind of ghost-like image to the background. And this helps blend the values together, and it also helps it fall further into the background. Now, if we compare that to his body, we can see that the focal point, which is our main character here, our two main characters, we can see that there is way more contrast in terms of the values, right? The body has the full range of values. We have this lighter tone, and then we have these darker tones here, all the way down into the shadows. And then we can see the same thing is taken to the next level when we look at this figure here, right? We have these very, very dark tones in the chest, right? along with these lighter tones that help kind of sculpt the figure. And what's interesting is you can basically do what I did here, which is you can begin to block out a lot of the darker shapes and put them all into one big shape. And as you put them into one big shape, you can kind of see how they all connect together with one another and how they help frame specific elements in the painting. So, for example, this hand and this sword here, it's absolutely framed with these darker shapes on either side of it, which help it stick out even more, right? So when I go back over it again and I drop in this red here, it becomes even clearer that this is kind of you can I wouldn't say this is necessarily the focal point, but we can see that there is a lot of attention that is being drawn to in terms of his arm going down to the sword, right? So the focal point is always where it is that we're going to put the most amount of contrast, and it's going to be where we put the most amount of detail, which is basically just contrast, right? So if I take off the saturation layer and I just look at this in terms of the color, this is how it is that it's mapped out, right? So just in terms of the color, we can see that there is quite a lot of darker browns, very earthy browns, earthy reds that are all throughout the bottom part of this painting. And then we get into these more yellowish flesh tones. But then we have this very saturated yellow background, right? And then again, we have these earthy tones and even a little bit of green in the figure himself, which is interesting because if we go back and we look at this scale again, let me hide the color. What do we see over here? We see that the color yellow, so this is basically the value range of each individual color. What it is that we see here is that the color yellow is almost exclusively in this very light value range, right? And then the darker oranges and reds, there's a little bit more variety in the orange. You could say that the yellow and the red are kind of like the extremes of this reddish color, right? Which is pretty interesting because we don't think about red as being just generally one value type. But if we look at it on the scale, that's what it seems like. So again, if we look at these colors and then we put the saturation back on, and let me turn this off, what do we see? We see that the lighter values have a very yellow tint to them, right? Whereas we can see that these darker colors have a much darker value to them, obviously, right? But we can start to see how it is that these colors are organized. We have these darker reds and these oranges that you could say form up the majority of this painting. And then there's a contrast to that with this lighter yellow that's sitting here in the background, right? So this is something that is very useful to understand whenever it is that you're doing your own work, right? Is to understand that we have these contrasts between dark and light, and how that relates to the actual color it is that you are using in the painting it is that you're doing. But also, you want to think about the edges. What is it that you actually want to emphasize? Whatever it is that you emphasize, that's where the viewer is going to look, right? So clearly, the viewer is supposed to look here. He's not supposed to be looking over here in the corner at this skull in the background, right? So there's no reason for him to have hard edges, for him to have, uh, you know, a lot of value range back here. He can keep the value range close in order to give it this kind of ghost-like image here. But then here he explores the full range of the values in the figures. And so you could think about it in terms of when you're planning your illustration, and you have a foreground, middle ground, and background. You can think to yourself, or actually, let's just focus on foreground and middle ground. I could make the decision to make the foreground light with soft edges, or I could make it light with hard edges, which would be interesting, right? Because you want to experiment with this. And then the background, you could do the opposite. So you could do dark with hard edges, or dark with soft, right? And you could begin to design some thumbnails based off of this concept. And so that might look something like you have a very dark background, right? Let's just say you have a very dark background on these two, right? And then you go back in here with this, and let's say I was trying to redesign this with uh, with a foreground that's very light with soft edges, right? So if I was trying to redesign this with very soft edges, it might be I might start with something like this. And I might start to zoom in and try to figure out like what the actual composition would look like if I was to break it down in terms of having more of a loose edge, and how would that impact the rest of the image? What if all the hard edges were back here in the back and the soft edges were in the front? How would that create contrast? And so these are different things it is that you can just experiment with. That might not have been the best example. I'm not going to fully get into that because this video it would be a little bit too in depth for that. But I'll do a variation of that in a future video. But you can see how it is that you can take these things, and once it is that you break them down and you understand how it is that they're using contrast, you can then take those same techniques and begin to employ them into the illustrations it is that you do on your own. And they can become basically the framework for what it is that you do. So, anyways, guys, I hope this video was of use to you. If so, please leave a comment. Let me know what you think. I'm going to be doing some more videos like this. I've got more tutorial videos coming in the future. And thank you so much for checking out my channel. Thank you and take care.